Nobody announced it. There was no press conference at the airport. There was no ISPR statement released before the plane landed. There was no Truth Social post from Trump saying, "Watch what is happening in Tehran right now." On Wednesday evening, April 15th, Pakistan's Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir quietly landed in Tehran. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met him at the airport, posted a short video of the arrival on X, and wrote that he was delighted to welcome Field Marshal Munir to Iran, expressing gratitude for Pakistan's gracious hosting of dialogue. And then the meetings began. 48 hours later, the Strait of Hormuz was open. Not partially open, not open on 3 ships a day, coordinated by IRGC officers on a specific Larak Island bypass route. Araghchi posted on X that the passage for all commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz is declared completely open for the remaining period of the ceasefire. Oil crashed more than 10% in a single session. Stocks had their best day in weeks. Trump posted in capital letters that Iran has just announced the strait is fully open and ready for full passage. The Dow surged, airlines surged, energy-sensitive sectors exploded higher. A world that had been holding its breath for 48 days exhaled. And almost no one traced the sequence backward to Wednesday evening. And the man who quietly got off a plane in Tehran carrying messages from Washington and a specific proposal for breaking the nuclear deadlock that had collapsed the Islamabad talks 3 days earlier. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what Field Marshal Munir did in Tehran across 48 hours of meetings that the world barely noticed while it was watching Trump's CBS interview and Iran's uranium denial on Friday morning, why the specific architecture of Pakistan's mediation has made Munir the most consequential military officer in the world's most important diplomatic process right now, what the nuclear compromise framework he reportedly carried into Tehran means, and why it represents the first concrete bridging proposal that both sides have not immediately rejected. Why the strait's reopening on Friday was connected not to Trump's announcement, but to what Munir negotiated 2 days earlier. What gold trading above $4,800 and oil crashing 12% in a single session are telling you about the ceasefire's actual trajectory, and why a Pakistani field marshal flying quietly into Tehran might have done more to reopen 1/5 of the world's oil supply in 48 hours than 6 weeks of American airstrikes, blockades, and ultimatums achieved in 6 weeks of the most expensive war since the Second World War. Let us start with the man himself, and why Munir's access to Tehran is structurally different from anything the United States can do directly. Field Marshal Asim Munir is not simply Pakistan's army chief. He is, by the consistent assessment of every diplomatic analyst covering South Asian and Middle Eastern affairs, the de facto decision-maker in Pakistan. When Trump said at the ceasefire announcement on April 8th that he had agreed to suspend attacks based on conversations with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir of Pakistan, and when Araghchi was profuse in his gratitude to Pakistan's role, both leaders were describing the same thing. The ceasefire that stopped the largest oil supply shock in recorded history was not produced by ambassadors or foreign ministries operating through formal channels. It was produced by a series of direct conversations between Munir and the Iranian and American leadership, operating at the military-to-military and political-to-military level that is different in character from foreign ministry communication. Munir has been building this relationship architecture for years. He visited Tehran for the first time as Army Chief in July 2023 and met both Iran's foreign minister and its military chief of general staff. He visited again in November 2025 with Prime Minister Sharif and met Iran's supreme leader. He was at the White House in September 2025 and met Trump, Vance, and Rubio in the same session. He brokered the India-Pakistan ceasefire in May 2025 after Marco Rubio called him at 4 a.m. Islamabad time. He coordinated the Islamabad talks in April 2026 that brought J.D. Vance and Iran's parliament speaker to the same table for the first time since 1979. He is the single individual in this entire geopolitical architecture who has sat in private meetings with the Iranian leadership, the American leadership, the Saudi leadership, and the Chinese leadership in the same 12-month period. Al Jazeera's analysis of how Pakistan managed to get the United States and Iran to a ceasefire described Munir as central to the entire operation. It quoted an expert who said Tehran's choice of Pakistan as mediator was deliberate. Pakistan was chosen not because it is a powerful middle power with an American military base, but precisely because it is a regional country with credibility on both sides. A professor emeritus of international relations at Quaid-i-Azam University in Islamabad described Pakistan's role by saying a messenger transmits, but Pakistan shaped the sequencing, timing, and framing of proposals. It had leverage with all sides. That leverage is the specific product of Munir's relationship architecture. Iran trusts him because he has met their leadership repeatedly at the highest level and has not betrayed those relationships. The United States trusts him because he brokered the India-Pakistan ceasefire under direct American pressure and delivered. Saudi Arabia trusts him because Pakistan signed a strategic military development agreement with Riyadh in September 2025. with Munir in attendance. He is simultaneously acceptable to all parties in a conflict where every other potential mediator is disqualified by alignment with one side. When the Islamabad talks collapsed on April 12th and Vance boarded Air Force 2 at 3 in the morning, the specific failure was the nuclear question. Vance said Iran refused to commit to not seeking nuclear weapons. Iran said American demands were excessive. The gap between the American position of zero enrichment forever and the Iranian position of enrichment as a non-negotiable sovereign right had not closed after 21 hours of negotiations. And within 48 hours of that collapse, while the world was watching Trump announce the blockade and Iran threatened 3 waterways and the Islamabad talks analyze its own failure, Munir was already preparing his next move. He flew to Tehran on Wednesday evening, April 15th. He flew quietly. Aragji posted the video at the airport. The statement was warm but brief, and then the meetings began that the international press mostly watched from the outside without understanding what was being communicated inside. Here is what the Pakistan Today reporting and the Al Jazeera, sourcing from officials close to the mediation effort, tell us about what Munir actually brought to Tehran and what he was proposing across those 48 hours. The nuclear compromise framework Munir reportedly carried into Tehran addressed the single gap that caused Islamabad to fail. Iran's position going into Islamabad was that uranium enrichment is a non-negotiable sovereign right. America's position was zero enrichment permanently. Between those two absolute positions, there's mathematically no overlap. No formulation can satisfy zero enrichment in America and continued enrichment in Iran simultaneously. So the only way to bridge the gap is to reframe the question, so neither side is asked to abandon its stated red line entirely. The framework Munir reportedly proposed does exactly that. According to Pakistan Today's reporting and sources familiar with the mediation, Iran has in principle agreed to a proposal for third-party monitoring of its nuclear program, involving 4 countries alongside the International Atomic Energy Agency. The United States is pushing for a suspension of uranium enrichment for up to 20 years in exchange for sanctions relief. Iran is offering a shorter pause of approximately 5 years. The gap between 20 years and 5 years sounds large, but a hybrid arrangement of approximately 10 years under a jointly monitored mechanism, with Iran not permanently surrendering its enrichment right, but suspending it for a defined period under a verification architecture that the international community can endorse, is structurally different from both the American zero enrichment demand and Iran's continue enrichment position. It creates a zone of potential agreement that did not exist when Vance sat down at Islamabad. The sources in this reporting are careful. They say Iran has in principle agreed to the monitoring proposal. They do not say Iran has agreed to the specific duration. They say technical teams from both sides are currently engaged in continuous message exchanges. They say a hybrid arrangement could emerge. The language is conditional and preliminary, but conditional and preliminary is structurally different from the position on April 12th when Vance said Iran chose not to accept our terms, and Baghai said enriched uranium is as sacred as Iranian soil. The movement from categorical refusal to in-principle engagement with a monitoring framework is the specific movement that Munir's Tehran visit appears to have facilitated. The specific people Munir met in Tehran across Wednesday and Thursday deserve attention because the list is not the list of a diplomatic courtesy visit. It is the list of a man who needed to obtain something from every power center in the Iranian state simultaneously. He met Foreign Minister Abbas Aragji Wednesday evening. Aragji is the voice of Iran's diplomatic position and the person who carries messages between the political leadership and the American negotiators through the Pakistani channel. Aragji welcomed Munir with warmth and publicly described him as someone embodying Iran's deep relationship with Pakistan. That warmth is not incidental. It is the specific social capital that Munir has accumulated through years of consistent engagement with Iranian leadership across administrations and before and during the war. He met Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf on Thursday morning. Ghalibaf is significant for a specific reason. He was the person who led Iran's delegation at the Islamabad talks. He was the person who said after Islamabad that the U.S. failed to gain the trust of the Iranian delegation. He was the person who accused Trump of lying in X posts on Friday when Trump claimed Iran agreed to everything. If there is a hardliner position within the Iranian negotiating establishment, Ghalibaf represents it. For Munir to meet Ghalibaf specifically, and for Iranian state television to broadcast that meeting prominently, means Munir was not just talking to the diplomatic wing. He was specifically engaging the skeptical hardliner who needed to be brought inside the framework before any framework could be announced. He met Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. The president's office represents the civilian political authority that needs to endorse any agreement. Pezeshkian has been the most publicly amenable of Iran's senior leaders to diplomacy, having signaled readiness to continue discussions, provided they remain within international law. Presidential endorsement of the monitoring framework proposal would give it the political legitimacy to survive hardliner opposition in the parliament and the IRGC. He met Major General Ali Abdullahi, the commander of Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters. This is the man who issued the 3-waterway shutdown threat on Wednesday. The commander of the operational military headquarters that has been running this war. For Munir to sit across from Abdullahi, who days earlier had publicly threatened to close the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Red Sea simultaneously if the American blockade continued, and to have that conversation in private, is the most specific and most consequential meeting of the 48 hours. Because Abdullahi controls the operational posture. Araghchi and Pezeshkian can agree to a diplomatic framework. Ghalibaf can endorse it in the parliament, but if Abdullahi's command structure is not inside the framework, the IRGC can execute the 3-waterway threat regardless of what any political or diplomatic official has agreed to. Munir needed Abdullahi in the room, and he got him. The Strait's reopening 48 hours after Munir's arrival is the specific evidence of what those meetings produced in aggregate. The reopening announcement was made by Araghchi, linked to the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire as the stated occasion for the gesture. But the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire was itself the product of a diplomatic process that Pakistan had been engaged in actively. And the specific connection between Munir's Wednesday evening arrival and Friday's reopening announcement is not circumstantial. The Al Jazeera sourcing, the Pakistan Today reporting, and the Washington Times photo of Munir being welcomed by Araghchi at the airport that ran on Friday, the day of the reopening, all point to the same sequence. Munir arrived. He met everyone who needed to be in the room. And 2 days later, the strait that had been closed or controlled for 48 days declared itself completely open for commercial vessels. That sequence is the most important operational lesson in modern diplomacy that almost nobody is discussing, because the world was watching Trump say agreed to everything on CBS at the same moment the actual mechanism of agreement was being processed through a Pakistani general's back-channel framework. Let us now talk about what Pakistan's mediation architecture actually looks like structurally, because understanding it is the key to understanding why this crisis will resolve or not resolve through Pakistani channels rather than through direct American-Iranian negotiation. Al Jazeera's definitive feature on how Pakistan managed to get the two sides to a ceasefire documented the specific chronology. Pakistan's Army Chief spoke directly to Trump from March 22nd to 23rd. Trump announced a 5-day pause on strikes targeting Iranian energy infrastructure by then. On March 23rd, Pakistan formally offered to host talks. Sharif publicly tagged Trump, Araghchi, and Witkoff on X within hours. On March 29th, foreign ministers of Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia gathered in Islamabad for their second meeting in 10 days. In late March, Pakistan and China published a joint 5-point initiative including ceasefire, early dialogue, civilian protection, restoration of shipping, and a UN role. Pakistan's Interior Minister Mohsin Naqvi participated in mediation alongside Munir and Sharif across multiple channels simultaneously. And Trump confirmed at the ceasefire announcement that China had played a role, which was also a Pakistani-facilitated coordination, since Pakistan is the country with active military and diplomatic lines to both Washington and Beijing. The dual-track strategy that Al Jazeera described, PM Sharif reassuring Gulf allies and building a broader support coalition while Munir engages in hard negotiations between the two sides to narrow gaps, reflects Pakistan's specific structural advantage. Pakistan is the only country in this negotiation that can simultaneously sit in a room with Iran's IRGC commanders, Saudi Arabia's crown prince, the American president, the Chinese leadership, and Turkey and Egypt's foreign ministers. No other country has all of those relationships at the level required for them to matter in a crisis of this magnitude. Sharif's Gulf tour this week while Munir was in Tehran was not coincidental or separate. It was the second track of the same operation. Sharif went to Saudi Arabia first, then Qatar, then Turkey. Saudi Arabia needs the Strait open for its own oil exports. Qatar's LNG exports depend on the same waterway. Turkey is a NATO member with unique access to both Western institutions and Gulf relationships. Every stop on Sharif's tour was building the regional consensus that creates political space for Iran to make a gesture without looking like it capitulated to American pressure. The Gulf states, Turkey and Saudi Arabia telling Iran privately that they need the Strait open and that Iran's long-term relationships with these neighbors depend on a reasonable resolution, provides Iran with political cover for the kind of confidence-building gestures that Araghchi's Friday announcement represented. The nuclear compromise framework deserves a final specific examination because it is the piece that determines whether what happened this week is the beginning of the end of this crisis or the beginning of another false dawn. The specific numbers reportedly on the table are 20 years from the United States and 5 years from Iran. A 10-year hybrid arrangement is the described potential middle ground. But the duration is less important than the verification architecture. The monitoring proposal that Munir reportedly carried to Tehran and that Iran reportedly agreed to, in principle, involves 4 countries alongside the IAEA. Pakistan Today described 4 countries alongside the IAEA as the monitoring mechanism. This is a specific structural innovation that the 2015 JCPOA did not include. The JCPOA relied on IAEA inspections, with a European, American, Chinese, Russian oversight framework. The new proposal apparently contemplates a different multi-country verification architecture that is not dominated by American-aligned powers. If China, Russia, Pakistan, and one neutral 4th country are part of the monitoring mechanism alongside the IAEA, Iran has a verification system it can trust because it is not one where American allies control the inspections and interpretation of findings. That specific architecture is more acceptable to Iran than the JCPOA was, because Iran's core critique of the JCPOA was that America withdrew from it unilaterally in 2018, and the verification mechanism did not prevent that withdrawal. A monitoring architecture with China and Russia as co-guarantors creates a political cost for American unilateral withdrawal that the original JCPOA lacked. Whether that architecture is acceptable to the United States Congress, which would need to ratify any binding agreement, is a separate question. Rubio said on Saturday that Iran can have a civilian nuclear energy program. That statement, if maintained, creates the political space for an arrangement where Iran suspends weapons-grade enrichment under strict monitoring but retains civilian enrichment rights. That is fundamentally different from the zero enrichment position that Trump staked out publicly throughout this conflict. The fact that Rubio is now describing a civilian program as acceptable is the first American official statement that the zero enrichment red line has a caveat. That caveat is the specific diplomatic movement that Munir's Tehran meetings may have produced. Now let us connect all of this to the prices and the market reality of Saturday, April 18th. Gold is trading above $4,800 per ounce. Oil crashed more than 12% on Friday on the Hormuz reopening news. Stocks had their best session in weeks. The market is pricing a deal. It is specifically pricing the version of events that Trump described on CBS, which is Iran agreed to everything. But the more precise and more accurate price signal is that the market is pricing what the Munir visit to Tehran actually accomplished, which is a partial reopening of the Strait as a confidence-building gesture, a nuclear monitoring framework that Iran has in principle accepted, and a diplomatic trajectory toward a second round of talks that both sides have described as imminent. That trajectory is more durable than Trump's version of events because it is confirmed by Iranian actions rather than contradicted by them. The Strait is open. That is a fact confirmed by Aragchi's post, by vessel tracking data, by oil prices falling 12%. The monitoring framework is reportedly in principle accepted. That is confirmed by Pakistani officials close to the mediation. The ceasefire is reportedly being extended. That is confirmed by an in-principle agreement described by regional officials to the Associated Press. These 3 things together describe a genuine diplomatic process that is producing real results, even if Trump's characterization of those results as agreed to everything is not accurate, and Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson is correct that the nuclear details have not been formally concluded. The specific risk embedded in Friday's prices is still the gap between what is described as agreed and what is actually on paper. The uranium transfer to the United States that Trump described is denied by Iran. The ending of proxy support for Hamas and Hezbollah that Trump claimed Iran agreed to is not mentioned in any Iranian statement and is almost certainly not part of the current framework. The commitment to never close the strait that Trump announced has been publicly disputed by Iran's parliament speaker. Those gaps mean the deal that the market priced on Friday is not the deal that exists on paper today. What exists on paper today is a ceasefire that expires on April 21st, an in-principle acceptance of a monitoring framework that has not been formally agreed, and a partial strait reopening that requires IRGC coordination and is explicitly tied to the duration of the ceasefire period. For gold above $4,800, the path forward runs through whether the second round of talks produces a formal text before April 21st, or whether a ceasefire extension is agreed to give the technical teams more time to convert the in-principle framework into an actual agreement. JP Morgan at $5,000 and UBS at $6,200 are forecasts built on the conflict stabilizing and the rate expectations headwind from oil inflation moderating. A strait that is functionally open reduces that headwind. A nuclear monitoring framework that removes the imminent weapons threat reduces the geopolitical risk premium embedded in every defense budget, every Treasury yield calculation, and every central bank reserve policy that has been affected by the conflict. The structural bull case for gold remains intact because the 48 days of disruption have caused damage to global supply chains, emergency stockpiles, and shipping infrastructure that does not reverse immediately when the strait opens. But the acute risk premium that was suppressing equities and spiking oil begins unwinding the moment the monitoring framework goes from in principle to formal text. The IMF that cut global growth to 3.1% and raised global inflation to 4.4% this week made those projections before the Strait partial reopening. If the opening holds and the second round of talks produces a framework agreement within the next 10 days, the IMF's projections begin moving in the other direction, not dramatically. The infrastructure damage, mine clearing requirements, shipping backlog, and LNG facility repairs are long-term supply chain constraints that persist for months or years, regardless of any diplomatic outcome. But the direction of the trajectory from getting worse to getting less bad is the specific change that Munir's Tehran visit may have initiated. For silver in the mid-70s, the same trajectory applies. Industrial demand recovers as the global economy stops absorbing oil shock damage. The solar panel, electronics, and electric vehicle applications that drive silver's structural demand case remain intact. The monetary demand case from inflation fear begins moderating as oil prices fall from conflict peaks. Silver's dual identity tug-of-war, which has made it the most volatile major asset throughout this conflict, begins resolving in favor of industrial demand recovery if the diplomatic trajectory continues. The reason this specific story, Pakistan's Army Chief quietly landing in Tehran on a Wednesday evening, deserves to be told in full and understood completely is that it is the story the market is not quite telling itself. The market is telling itself Trump made a deal. The actual story is that a Pakistani field marshal with relationships on every side of a conflict nobody thought could be resolved without years more of war, spent 48 hours in Tehran meeting the foreign minister, the parliament speaker who led the hardliner delegation in Islamabad, the president, and the IRGC commander who threatened to close 3 waterways, and produced from those 48 hours a partial strait reopening, an in-principle nuclear monitoring acceptance, and a diplomatic trajectory toward a second round of talks. That is not the story of a man who flew to Tehran as a messenger. That is the story of a man who flew to Tehran as an architect. The professor who said Pakistan shaped the sequencing, timing, and framing of proposals was describing something specific and accurate. The specific proposal that Iran has in principle accepted, 4-country monitoring, alongside the IAEA with a hybrid enrichment suspension duration, did not come from Washington. It came from Islamabad. It came from a man who had sat in rooms with the Iranian supreme leader, the IRGC commander, the American president, and the Saudi crown prince, and who had calculated that the formulation that would work was one that neither side could call a defeat. The ceasefire expires in 3 days. The second round of talks has not been formally scheduled, but is expected imminently. The strait is open for the duration of the ceasefire. The nuclear monitoring framework is in principle accepted. Pakistan's army chief is likely traveling next to Washington to present the Iranian response to American negotiators. And the man who made all of this possible, who landed quietly in Tehran on a Wednesday evening while the world was watching Trump's CBS interview and analyzing Iran's uranium denial, is the most important person in the world right now whose name most people reading global headlines cannot spell. Field Marshal Asim Munir. He arrived on a Wednesday. The strait opened 48 hours later, and the world called it Trump's deal.